In the darkest corners of the world, beyond the reach of justice, exist prisons so corrupt that they defy the very notion of rehabilitation. These institutions, rather than serving as centers for correction, have become breeding grounds for violence, abuse, and unchecked power. Corruption in these prisons runs so deep that guards, officials, and even governments profit from human suffering, treating inmates as commodities rather than individuals. Black Dolphin Prison in Russia, a maximum security nightmare, is one such place where inmates are treated as less than human. Prisoners are blindfolded upon entry, forced into stress positions, and subjected to brutal conditions. Corruption manifests in the form of guards who smuggle in goods for a price, often charging exorbitant fees for basic necessities. Those who cannot pay are left to suffer, sometimes starving due to the rationing of food meant for personal profit. Meanwhile, in Venezuela's Tocaron prison, the lines between inmates and authorities blur. Criminal organizations run the prison like a fortress, complete with swimming pools, nightclubs, and weapon stockpiles. Guards turn a blind eye in exchange for bribes, allowing prisoners to operate drug trafficking and kidnapping rings from inside. It's not uncommon for inmates to live more lavishly behind bars than they did in the outside world, provided they have the money to grease the right palms. Honduras' San Pedro Sula prison was once home to thousands of criminals, but it functioned more like an independent city. Armed inmates controlled entire sectors, collecting taxes from fellow prisoners and selling drugs openly. Corrupt officials played along, benefiting from the illicit economy that thrived inside. The government eventually shut it down, but not before it stood as a testament to the absolute breakdown of law within a correctional facility. In Madagascar's Antanamara prison, overpopulation and bribery define the experience. Designed for 800 inmates but housing over 3,000, the prison is a disease-ridden hellhole where only those who can afford bribes receive decent meals or medical treatment. Inmates who can't pay their way out are left in cells so overcrowded that many sleep standing up. For the right price, even the most dangerous criminals can secure early release, making justice a purchasable commodity. The Bangkok Remand prison in Thailand is another notorious example of corruption at its worst. Officially, it houses individuals awaiting trial, but the reality is a chaotic blend of bribery and brutality. Prisoners can buy better cells, reduced sentences, and even drugs smuggled in by guards. Those who refuse to pay find themselves subject to random beatings, extended sentences, or planted evidence ensuring they never leave. One of the most feared prisons in the world, Gitarama Central Prison in Rwanda, forces inmates into conditions so horrendous that death often seems like a mercy. Built to hold 500 people but cramming in over 6,000, prisoners are left without enough food, clean water, or even floor space to sleep. Corrupt officials pocket money meant for inmate welfare, leaving prisoners to fight, sometimes to the death, over scraps of food. Disease runs rampant and bodies frequently pile up before being disposed of without record. El Salvador's infamous Zacatecoluca prison, better known as Zacatraz, houses some of the most dangerous gang members in the country. The guards are just as ruthless as the criminals inside, using excessive force and extorting inmates for protection. Gangs still operate within its walls, running extortion rackets and smuggling drugs with the cooperation of corrupt officials. The line between law enforcement and organized crime is virtually non-existent here. Sierra Leone's Pademba Road prison represents another glaring example of corruption. Bribery determines everything, from food rations to medical treatment. Without money, prisoners are left in extreme conditions where malnutrition and disease are a daily battle. Guards often sell privileged positions to wealthier inmates who then exploit the weaker prisoners for forced labor and other abuses. In Libya, the Ain Zara prison is more of a lawless dungeon than a government facility. Reports of extrajudicial killings, torture, and extortion are rampant. With no official oversight, the prison is essentially run by militia groups who use it to detain and abuse political prisoners. Families must pay to see their loved ones, and those who can't afford to do so may never hear from them again. Over in Brazil, Porto Velho's Urso Branco prison has gained infamy for its inhumane treatment of inmates. Gangs dictate daily life, and violence is so extreme that beheadings are common. Guards accept bribes to allow assassinations within the prison, and riots frequently erupt due to the power struggles between rival factions. The official death toll is vastly underreported, as corruption covers up the full extent of the brutality. In Mexico, the Apodaca prison massacre exposed the deep corruption within the country's prison system. Guards allowed members of the Zetas cartel to stage an attack on their rivals, the Gulf Cartel, leading to the deaths of 44 inmates. Investigations revealed that many of the weapons used were smuggled in with the cooperation of prison officials. The incident highlighted how powerful cartels are able to buy their way into control even from behind bars. The Democratic Republic of Congo's Makala prison suffers from extreme corruption, where prison officials sell cells to those who can afford them. Poor inmates are crammed into tiny, unsanitary spaces, often left without food unless they can pay. The wealthier prisoners, including corrupt politicians and war criminals, enjoy a life of relative comfort with access to mobile phones, drugs, and even prostitutes. Chikurubi Maximum Security Prison in Zimbabwe is a place where money dictates survival. The prison is critically underfunded, with resources meant for inmates siphoned off by corrupt officials. Food rations are so small that many prisoners die from starvation or malnutrition-related diseases. However, those with deep pockets can pay for outside meals, private cells, and even the ability to leave the prison under the guise of medical treatment. In Kenya's Kamatai Maximum Security Prison, bribery is the only way to secure any form of decent treatment. Prison guards demand payments for everything from access to a bed to permission for family visits. Without money, prisoners are subjected to relentless abuse, with some even forced into labor under the threat of beatings or fabricated disciplinary charges that extend their sentences. Corruption in these prisons is not just about money, it is about absolute power and the abuse of human rights. The world's most corrupt prisons expose the flaws in justice systems, where those in power prioritize their own gain over the dignity and safety of those incarcerated. Governments turn a blind eye, knowing that within these walls, brutality is the currency that keeps the system running. The question remains, how many lives will be lost before real change is made? In countries where corruption runs rampant, prisons become a reflection of a broken system. Rather than being places of reform or rehabilitation, they become a breeding ground for corruption, where inmates are pawns in a game of power and money. In the most notorious prisons, the corrupt system thrives on the suffering of individuals who are trapped in an unrelenting cycle of violence and exploitation. Take the case of the notorious La Modelo prison in Colombia, where corruption runs so deep that prisoners can purchase anything from a cell phone to narcotics. The prison is controlled by gangs, and guards are often in the pockets of these criminal organizations. Violence is commonplace, with inmates routinely subjected to brutality at the hands of their fellow prisoners or the corrupt guards who enable them. The correctional system in the Philippines is another example where corruption permeates the prison environment. In the New Bilibid prison, drug cartels operate with the support of corrupt officials, turning the facility into a hub for drug trafficking and other illegal activities. Prisoners live in conditions that would be considered inhumane anywhere else, but for those with money, life behind bars can be far more comfortable. The Guantanamo Bay detention camp in Cuba, though infamous for its human rights abuses and torture tactics, also showcases the dark side of corruption in prisons. Despite being under the control of the U.S. military, reports of abuse, bribery, and inhumane conditions have surfaced. Even those detained there for years without trial find themselves at the mercy of a corrupt system that seems to exist above the law. In Iran's Evin prison, political prisoners are subjected to torture and extreme conditions, but corruption plays a significant role in their fate. Guards and prison officials accept bribes for favors, such as allowing prisoners to contact family members or securing their release. It's a system where money and connections can determine life or death, making justice a privilege for the wealthy and powerful. When you look at prisons like the Yida refugee camp in South Sudan, it becomes evident that corruption isn't confined to official government-run prisons. In these camps, corruption among the guards allows for violence, exploitation, and the smuggling of goods in exchange for bribes. Inmates, many of whom are refugees fleeing conflict, find themselves trapped in a corrupt and brutal system where survival often depends on the ability to pay for protection. In prisons around the world, the greatest victims of corruption are often the most vulnerable, those who are already marginalized or trapped by poverty. Corruption is not just a byproduct of a flawed system, it is the very thing that allows these systems to perpetuate themselves. Until the corruption at the heart of these prisons is addressed, the cycle of abuse, exploitation, and injustice will continue to claim more lives. This cycle begins long before prisoners are even incarcerated. Many individuals are pushed into the criminal justice system due to systemic inequalities in society. Poverty, lack of education, and limited access to resources create a breeding ground for criminal activity. Once incarcerated, the system often continues to prey on these individuals, offering little support for rehabilitation and reintegration into society. Instead, it perpetuates their suffering, ensuring that they remain trapped in a cycle of crime and punishment. In corrupt prison systems, inmates are often treated as commodities rather than human beings. The conditions they endure, overcrowding, unsanitary facilities, inadequate healthcare, and limited access to basic needs, are a direct result of institutionalized corruption. Inmates are subjected to physical and mental abuse by both fellow prisoners and prison guards who exploit their positions of power. This abuse is often carried out with impunity, as corruption ensures that those responsible face no consequences. Prison staff, many of whom are underpaid and overworked, are themselves victims of the corrupt system. They may resort to bribery, extortion, or abuse in order to survive within the prison's power dynamics. In some cases, guards act as enforcers for criminal organizations operating inside the prisons, further entrenching the corrupt nature of the system. The line between law enforcement and criminals becomes increasingly blurred, creating a dangerous environment where justice is distorted and the rights of prisoners are ignored. The role of money in the corruption of prison systems cannot be overstated. In many countries, private prisons exist to turn a profit, and this financial incentive often overrides the well-being of those incarcerated. Corporations that profit from the prison industrial complex have an interest in keeping prisons overcrowded and understaffed. They lobby for stricter laws and longer sentences to ensure a steady flow of inmates. These corporations often exploit prison labor, using inmates for cheap work while providing them with little compensation or protection. The use of prison labor in corrupt systems is particularly insidious. Inmates are often forced into grueling labor without proper compensation, working in unsafe conditions for little or no pay. This labor is used to produce goods and services that generate significant profits for private corporations and the government. In many cases, prison labor is used to cut costs, further perpetuating the cycle of exploitation and making it harder for prisoners to escape their circumstances. In some countries, corruption extends beyond the walls of the prison and into the judicial system itself. Judges and prosecutors may be bribed to secure convictions, or lawyers may be bought off to ensure a guilty verdict. The lack of accountability in the judicial system ensures that innocent people are wrongfully imprisoned, while those with money and influence can manipulate the system to their advantage. The corrupt influence of money in the judicial system further undermines the integrity of the legal process, leaving the most vulnerable individuals at the mercy of a biased and unjust system. In many corrupt prison systems, there is little focus on rehabilitation or reintegration. Instead, the emphasis is placed on punishment and control. Education programs, vocational training, and mental health services are often underfunded or non-existent. Without access to these essential services, prisoners have little opportunity to reform or build a better life for themselves once they are released. This lack of support increases the likelihood that they will reoffend, perpetuating the cycle of incarceration. The lack of focus on rehabilitation is also reflected in the way prisoners are treated once they are released. Former inmates often face significant barriers to reintegration, such as difficulty finding employment, housing, or accessing healthcare. These challenges are compounded by the stigma of having a criminal record, which often prevents them from fully participating in society. Without support, many ex-prisoners fall back into criminal behavior, leading to a cycle of recidivism that is difficult to break. The impact of corruption in the prison system extends beyond the individuals directly affected. It also has far-reaching consequences for society as a whole. When people are incarcerated in unjust and corrupt systems, they are less likely to be rehabilitated, and their chances of reintegration into society are diminished. This leads to higher rates of crime, greater societal division, and a lack of trust in the justice system. The corruption of the prison system undermines the rule of law, making it harder for society to address the root causes of crime and violence. Reforming corrupt prison systems is a complex and challenging task, but it is not impossible. The first step is to acknowledge the extent of the corruption and its impact on both inmates and society. Governments must take responsibility for addressing the systemic issues that allow corruption to thrive, including improving the conditions in which prisoners are held, ensuring that prison staff are properly trained and compensated, and providing adequate resources for rehabilitation and reintegration programs. Prison reform should focus on creating a system that prioritizes justice, human rights, and rehabilitation rather than punishment and profit. International organizations, human rights groups, and civil society organizations have a crucial role to play in advocating for prison reform and holding governments accountable for the treatment of prisoners. By shining a light on the corruption and abuse that exists within prison systems, these organizations can raise awareness and mobilize public support for change. They can also provide valuable resources and expertise to help governments implement effective reforms that prioritize the well-being of prisoners. Education and awareness are also key components of prison reform. Public awareness campaigns can help to change the narrative around prisons and the people incarcerated within them. By shifting the focus from punishment to rehabilitation, society can begin to recognize the potential for positive change within the prison system. Education programs for both inmates and prison staff can also help to reduce recidivism rates and improve the overall functioning of the system. In addition to addressing the corruption within prisons themselves, it is essential to tackle the root causes of crime and incarceration. This includes addressing poverty, inequality, and lack of access to education and healthcare. By investing in social services and providing individuals with the tools they need to build a better life, society can reduce the number of people who are incarcerated in the first place. Preventative measures such as early intervention programs for at-risk youth can also help to break the cycle of crime and punishment before it begins. Restorative justice is another important concept to consider in prison reform. Rather than focusing solely on punishment, restorative justice seeks to repair the harm caused by crime and offer opportunities for offenders to make amends. This approach emphasizes accountability, empathy, and the healing of both victims and offenders. By incorporating restorative justice principles into prison systems, societies can move away from punitive measures and towards more compassionate and effective methods of addressing crime. As societies continue to grapple with the issue of prison reform, it is important to remember that the fight for justice is ongoing. Corruption within prison systems is a deeply entrenched problem, but it is one that can be overcome with collective effort and determination. The lives of the most vulnerable individuals in society are at stake, and it is our responsibility to ensure that the prison system serves as a means of rehabilitation and justice rather than a tool of exploitation and oppression. The path to reform will not be easy, but it is necessary if we are to create a more just and equitable society. By addressing the corruption at the heart of prison systems and working to create a system that values human dignity and rehabilitation, we can break the cycle of abuse and exploitation and pave the way for a more just and humane future. The fight for prison reform is not just a fight for the incarcerated, it is a fight for all of us, as it is a reflection of the values we hold as a society. These prisons, despite their bleak realities, are not beyond hope. If the world turns its attention to these institutions, demands accountability, and implements real reform, perhaps one day we'll see the dawn of a new era of justice, one where prisons can truly serve the purpose they were designed for: rehabilitation, not exploitation. The time for change is now, before more lives are lost to the indifference of a corrupt system.